Hi there, and welcome to the Procura Insights Podcast. I say podcast, but this is more of a playground, a place where we push boundaries and explore everything supply chain and business. In this episode, Mark Latent and the trailblazing Sarah Clark take us through a detailed examination of the role of SCM in strengthening economic governance and private sector growth in Sub-Saharan Africa. Let's jump in.
Imagine an economy that just has so much raw potential that it's perfectly positioned to become the next factory of the world.
Right.
Like, we're talking about a region that could conceivably capture, 85 million manufacturing jobs in the next generation?
It's a staggering number, yeah.
But right now, today, that exact same region is bleeding up to $400 billion a year through this just incredibly broken, highly corrupt government buying system.
Yeah.
And its economic growth has stalled out so severely that it would take half a century just to double the average person's standard of living. I mean, welcome to the grand paradox of Sub-Saharan Africa.
It is, it really is a staggering contradiction.
Yeah.
Because you have this undeniable demographic advantage, right, and a massive resource advantage.
Oh, absolutely.
But the internal machinery, the actual plumbing of the economy, if you want to call it that, is completely choked.
And that choked plumbing is exactly what we are focusing on for this deep dive, because we have a massive stack of source material today.
We really do.
We've got reports from the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the Southern African Customs Union, plus these incredibly detailed regional academic studies.
And they all essentially point to the same thing.
Right, this massive seismic economic shift that is currently underway. Because for decades, the old playbook in Sub-Saharan Africa, it relied on, temporary commodity booms. Selling raw copper or oil.
Right, just exporting the raw material.
Exactly. That and massive heavy-handed public investment by the state. But that playbook, it's dead. It is completely broken.
Yeah, it's done. The sovereign treasuries are simply tapped out. I mean, domestic borrowing costs are through the roof, official development assistance is declining, and the risk of national debt distress is just, it's flashing red across the continent.
Flashing red everywhere.
So the region is being forced into this massive paradigm shift. The new mandate from the IMF and the World Bank is very clear. Growth must be led by the private sector.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because when you say supply chain management and economic governance, which is what these reports emphasize, my eyes initially just glaze over.
I get that, yeah. It sounds like total textbook jargon.
It really does. But as I read through these reports, I realized we aren't just talking about, pushing paper around a warehouse.
No, not at all.
We're talking about who gets to build a power plant, how a freight train actually moves across a border, and how a government spends half of its entire budget.
Exactly. It's the physical reality of the economy.
So let's start with this macro-level growth problem. The IMF's Sub-Saharan Africa Growth Reset Report lays out some pretty sobering numbers. The recent average real GDP per capita growth has stalled at around 1.4%.
Which means, in human terms, that a child born today will be 50 years old before their community's standard of living doubles.
Wow.
Yeah. And that is simply unacceptable for a developing region with a booming youth population. You can't have growth that slow.
It really puts the crisis into perspective for you. And the historical context makes it even worse, right? Because the report notes that for nearly 3 decades, average labor productivity across the region has been broadly flat.
Completely flat.
While regions like East Asia saw this exponential productivity growth during the exact same period.
Right. Sub-Saharan Africa is just diverging completely from those success stories.
And then the IMF introduces this metric called total factor productivity, or TFP. And they say over the last 25 years, TFP has contributed an average of only 1/4 percentage point to regional growth.
1/4%?
Yeah, 1/4%. I need you to translate that for me. Because if labor productivity is just like how much a worker produces in an hour, what is total factor productivity? And why is 1/4% such a massive disaster?
Okay, let's think of it in terms of baking a loaf of bread.
Okay, I like bread.
Right. So labor is the baker. Capital is the oven and the ingredients.
Sure.
Now, if you want to bake more bread, you can just hire more bakers or buy more ovens.
Right.
And that is how much of Sub-Saharan Africa's historical growth happened. They just threw more raw labor and more capital at the economy. And they usually funded that by borrowing against high commodity prices.
So just brute force baking?
Exactly. Brute force, but total factor productivity is different. It is the recipe. It's the efficiency and the innovation of the system itself.
Ah, okay. So TIP is figuring out a way to bake twice as much bread using the exact same baker and the exact same oven, just by organizing the kitchen better.
Precisely. It represents technological advancement, better management, smoother logistics, stronger institutions.
The recipe.
Right. So when the IMF says TFP has only contributed 0.25% to growth over 25 years, they are saying the recipe hasn't improved in a quarter of a century.
That is wild.
The growth we have seen wasn't structural. It was brute force. And when the price of copper drops, the brute force growth vanishes. And it leaves behind nothing but debt.
So the IMF calculates a potential way out of this trap, right? They claim that if Sub-Saharan Africa could close just half of the structural gap with other emerging markets in 3 foundational areas, which they list as governance, business regulation, and the external sector.
Yeah, those 3.
If they do that, it could raise regional output by up to 20% over the next 5 to 10 years.
Which is massive.
A 20% jump in output is a massive dividend. But I mean, I have to push back on this a little bit.
Sure.
Isn't this 20% projection just like theoretical spreadsheet math?
Yeah.
Because we've seen developing nations try to aggressively liberalize their economies before, adopting these sweeping structural adjustments, only to be totally crushed by macroeconomic instability or, social riots.
And that skepticism is entirely warranted.
Yeah.
The IMF report actually explicitly acknowledges that danger.
Oh, they do?
Yeah, because foundational reforms are incredibly disruptive. You were talking about changing the rules of the game.
Yeah.
Which means taking power and money away from entrenched interests.
Right, people who benefit from the broken system.
Exactly. If you just drop a Western textbook reform onto a complex political reality, it will detonate.
It'll blow up in your face.
So this is why the IMF heavily emphasizes that reforms must be anchored in what they call a credible social contract.
Yeah.
You have to build consensus. And methodologically, they argue for 2 very specific strategies.
Which are?
Bundling and sequencing of reforms.
Bundling and sequencing. Okay, so it's not just overnight shock therapy. It's a calculated rollout.
Right.
Let's look at sequencing first. If a country is really struggling with basic state capacity, how do they even begin to sequence a massive governance overhaul?
Well, sequencing acknowledges reality. If a state's institutions are weak, aiming for a highly complex, high-depth reform on day 1 is just doomed to fail.
Because they can't handle it.
Right. You don't try to build a world-class commercial appellate court system overnight when your basic registries are still running on, paper ledgers.
Fair point.
Instead, you look for a phased, second-best approach that builds immediate credibility. The IMF points to countries like Rwanda and Benin.
Oh, yeah, I read about that in the stack.
They sequence their business environment reforms by starting with something very simple: online firm registration.
So instead of an entrepreneur having to travel all the way to the capital, stand in line for 3 days, and bribe 4 different clerks just to register a bakery?
They could do it on a smartphone in 20 minutes.
That is incredible.
It is. It's a tangible, highly visible early win. It reduces friction, it eliminates a vector for petty corruption, and most importantly, it signals to the private sector that the government is actually serious about change.
Okay, I see.
Once you've built that trust and momentum, then you can sequence the deeper, more complex judicial or regulatory frameworks. You build the foundation before you attempt the roof.
That makes perfect logical sense. And what about bundling? If I'm following the logic here, is it like if you privatize a state monopoly, but you don't bundle that with strong anti-monopoly laws, you haven't actually fixed the problem?
Nope.
You've just transferred the monopoly from a government bureaucrat to a private billionaire.
You've hit the nail on the head.
Yeah.
Bundling is about pairing economic policies so that you don't inadvertently create a monster.
Right.
If you deregulate trade, you must bundle it with labor market support or social safety nets, because some domestic industries will inevitably lose out to foreign competition.
People will lose jobs.
Yes, you have to manage that fallout, or the social contract breaks down completely. The reports actually highlight South Africa's Operation Vulindlela as a prime case study in attempting this kind of complex bundling and consensus building.
Yes, Operation Vulindlela. The name itself means to open the way in isiZulu, right?
That's correct.
And from the texts, it looks like it's a joint initiative between the South African presidency and the National Treasury. What exactly are they doing differently than previous reform efforts?
They are essentially acting as a bureaucratic icebreaker.
An icebreaker.
Yeah. Historically, government departments in South Africa like energy, transport, communications, they operated in these deeply entrenched silos. They didn't talk to each other.
So nothing got done.
Exactly. Operation Valimbla was designed to bypass those silos and accelerate specific structural reforms, particularly in logistics and electricity. And they engaged structurally with social partners,
Cool.
business leaders, labor unions, civil society. They do this to build that credible social contract we talked about. They negotiate the trade-offs so that when a difficult reform is passed, it actually endures beyond the next election cycle.
Wow, okay. So we have this tantalizing 20% growth potential contingent on getting the sequencing, the bundling, and the social contract right.
Right.
But as I was mentally walking through this scenario for you listening, I kept hitting a massive physical roadblock.
Which is?
Well, we want the private sector to lead. Say, I want to open a massive textile factory. I need roads to move my cotton. I need a functioning port to export my garments. And most of all, I need a reliable grid to power my sewing machines.
You need infrastructure.
Yes. But in almost all of these countries, those resources are locked up by state-owned enterprises.
The absolute elephants in the room.
Exactly.
If we are talking about the plumbing of the economy, state-owned enterprises, or SOEs, they are the main water mains. You literally cannot discuss private sector growth without confronting them.
Let's give everyone a sense of the scale here, because the numbers are just jaw-dropping.
They really are.
According to a sample of 14 Sub-Saharan African economies in the reports, SOEs account for between 30% and 50% of the national GDP.
Up to half the economy.
Right. They are not just players in the market, they largely dictate the market. But the reality is grim, because roughly 40% of these massive state entities are unprofitable.
Yeah.
They are just hemorrhaging money, costing governments an estimated 1% of their GDP in annual losses.
And we have to be clear about what a 1% GDP loss actually means.
It's a lot of money.
It's not monopoly money. That is sovereign treasury funds, backed by taxpayer dollars, being diverted to plug the leaks in a failing state utility instead of building schools, hospitals, or new infrastructure.
It's a tragedy.
And one of the primary drivers of these massive losses is that governments consistently mandate tariffs, the prices these SOEs charge for electricity or water, to be set below cost recovery levels.
So wait, it literally costs the state power company more money to generate a kilowatt of electricity than they are legally allowed to charge the citizen for using it.
Yes.
It's a built-in loss on every single transaction.
Every time you flip a switch, the state loses money.
I mean, I understand the political motivation, right? Leaders want to provide cheap power to citizens to win votes, but economically, it's a suicide pact. If the utility has no cash flow, they can't do maintenance.
Correct. The first thing to get cut when cash flow dries up is preventative maintenance.
Oh.
And the second thing is capital investment in new generation capacity. Fast forward a decade, the grid starts collapsing, rolling blackouts become the norm, and suddenly that politically popular cheap electricity doesn't actually exist when a factory needs it.
Which totally sabotages the IMF's dream of private sector-led growth.
Right.
A factory can't run on good intentions. It needs electrons.
Exactly.
This brings us to a really fascinating study by the University of Cape Town. They specifically looked at power sector reforms.
Yes, great study.
And it details how, back in the 1980s and 90s, OECD countries developed what they called the standard model for fixing broken state power sectors.
The standard model.
Right. And the prescription was simple on paper, right? Unbundle the massive state utility, separate the power plants from the transmission lines, privatize the assets, and create a free, competitive power market.
Well, the standard model was basically the gospel of the era. And under the influence of, Bretton Woods institutions.
Bank, right?
Right, exactly, particularly the World Bank. Developing nations were heavily pressured to adopt it. If a sub-Saharan African country wanted a development loan to build a new dam, the loan was often conditional on them implementing this textbook market-based unbundling.
But the UCT study points out a massive divergence in outcomes, because regions like Latin America adopted these competitive power markets relatively successfully.
Yes, they did.
But Sub-Saharan Africa tried to implement the exact same standard model, and it almost universally crashed and burned. Why did the exact same economic software work in Chile but completely fail in Sub-Saharan Africa?
What's fascinating here is the sheer oversight of the political economy context. The standard model was designed for highly developed economies that had excess generation capacity, incredibly strong independent regulators, and a high level of socioeconomic development.
Okay.
You cannot transplant that institutional structure into an environment plagued by severe power shortages, weak regulatory capacity, and deeply entrenched vested interests.
It's like taking the engine out of a Ferrari and trying to drop it into a 1990s tractor.
Or a flip phone.
So what does this all mean? The hardware, the political and economic context just couldn't run this standard model software? The system just rips itself apart?
That is an excellent way to conceptualize it. Because the structural reality couldn't support the standard model, most of Sub-Saharan Africa just abandoned the textbook and settled into a halfway house.
A halfway house.
The UCT study refers to this as the single buyer model.
Single buyer model. Okay, can you visualize that for me? How does it actually work in practice?
Think of it like an hourglass.
An hourglass.
At the top of the hourglass, you have a handful of private, independent power producers, or IPPs. They want to generate and sell electricity.
Okay, the private guys.
At the bottom of the hourglass, you have millions of citizens and businesses wanting to buy electricity. But the state-owned utility sits right at the narrow pinch point in the middle.
Ah, I see.
It retains an absolute monopoly on the transmission grid. Therefore, the state utility acts as the single aggregator of demand and the single counterparty. Every private power producer must sell their electricity to the state utility through a long-term contract.
And then the utility sells it to the public.
Exactly.
Okay, I see the hourglass. There is no open market where I, as a factory owner, can just buy power directly from a private solar farm. I have to buy it from the state pinch point.
We have to go through the state.
Oh, wait, we just established that the state utility is often completely broke because of those below-cost tariffs.
Right.
If I am an international investor building a massive wind farm at the top of the hourglass, why would I sign a 20-year contract to sell my power to a bankrupt state utility that might not pay me next month?
You wouldn't?
Right.
Unless you get a sovereign guarantee.
Ah.
The IPPs demand that the national government step in and guarantee the payments. If the utility defaults, the national treasury has to pay.
No.
This creates massive contingent liabilities, which drives up the country's national debt risk, which circles us right back to the macroeconomic instability the IMF warned about in the first place.
So what does this all mean for the future? We can't use the standard model, and the single buyer hourglass model is basically bankrupting the state. How do these governments fix their SOEs without completely abandoning their mandate to provide water, power, and rail to their people?
The source texts, particularly the research on sovereign supply chains, point toward a pragmatic structural compromise.
Which is?
Centralized holding companies.
Like a massive state-owned umbrella corporation that holds all the different utilities.
Conceptually, yes. The literature references proposals like the SANSOS concept in South Africa.
Which stands for the South African National State-Owned Company, right?
Correct. Or similar models like Indonesia's BPI Danantara. The strategic objective is to structurally decouple the commercial day-to-day operations of the SOEs from the short-term political cycle.
Okay, so separating politics from business.
Exactly. You pool the state's commercial assets into a single holding company, and you mandate that it be managed by independent professionals adhering to strict OECD corporate governance standards.
So let's play this out. If a politician is facing a really tough re-election campaign and calls up the head of the power utility demanding they slash electricity prices by 50% to win votes, what happens?
Well, under the old system, the utility boss likely complies to keep their job, and the utility goes bankrupt.
Oh, right.
Under the holding company model, that political directive has to go through the independent board. The board evaluates it and says, no, that directive violates our legal commercial mandate and our fiduciary duty to remain solvent.
So it acts as a structural shock absorber.
Exactly. The state, as the sole shareholder, still dictates the broad strategic and social objectives like expanding the grid to rural areas. But the holding company executives figure out how to execute that commercially without sinking the entire enterprise.
It hardens the budget constraints and stops the utilities from being used as giant patronage machines.
That's the goal.
That makes a lot of sense. But even if we successfully centralize these SOEs and force them to act commercially, we have to look at how they interact with the private sector every single day.
Right.
And the primary mechanism for that interaction, the way these giants actually move money into the economy, is through how they buy goods and services, which brings us to the shadowy, complex world of public procurement.
And, when people hear public procurement, they usually think of some administrator buying copy paper or office chairs.
Right, boring back office stuff.
They vastly underestimate the scale. Procurement is the lifeblood of the sovereign supply chain.
Let's put some numbers on it because it completely reframed my understanding. Across Sub-Saharan Africa, public procurement accounts for between 12% and 30% of the entire national GDP.
Massive.
It represents roughly 50% of all government expenditure. Half of the money government spend is deployed through procurement systems. But this is also where we see the absolute darkest side of weak economic governance. The reports indicate that procurement-related corruption generates losses of up to $400 billion annually across the continent.
$400 billion annually.
It's hard to even comprehend.
Let that sink in. That is not just inefficiency. That is a systemic hemorrhage that poses an existential threat to development.
The Auditor General of South Africa, the AGSA, produces these incredibly detailed reports that break down exactly how this money vanishes.
And it's not usually some cinematic heist with hackers and offshore accounts.
No.
It is mundane bureaucratic theft. It's irregular expenditure, it's the use of shell companies or having ghost suppliers listed on a preferred vendor database.
Or the payment of facilitation fees, which is just polite corporate speak for bribes.
Exactly.
If a municipality needs to build a water treatment plant and the procurement officer demands a massive kickback, the winning bidder just inflates the price of the contract to cover the bribe. So the state pays triple the market rate, the plant is built with substandard materials to cut costs, and the community goes without clean water.
And this is precisely why modern supply chain management can no longer be viewed as a back-office administrative chore. SCM is a frontline instrument for economic governance.
It has to be.
If a state wants to deter supplier opportunism and stop that $400 billion bleed, it has to modernize the architecture of how it buys. The research heavily emphasizes integrating digital infrastructure.
Like Industry 4.0 technology.
Yeah, robust e-procurement platforms and cybersecurity.
I assume because a digital platform is just much harder to bribe than a human clerk with a paper ledger.
Exactly. When you digitize the entire procurement lifecycle, from the initial tender to the final invoice, you create an immutable, auditable data trail. You drastically reduce the human touchpoints where those facilitation fees historically change hands.
It forces transparency out into the open.
It does.
But the sources also highlight that procurement isn't just being used defensively to stop corruption, right? Governments are actively using this massive purchasing power offensively to engineer socioeconomic outcomes.
Yes.
This is broadly categorized as affirmative procurement.
Yeah, affirmative procurement is the strategic deployment of state buying power to develop local industries, support marginalized demographics, and correct historical economic imbalances.
So instead of simply awarding a contract to the absolute cheapest established multinational supplier, a government intentionally favors local, disadvantaged, or smaller enterprises.
Right. And the texts detail a very clear case study from Nigeria regarding supplier development programs.
Oh, right.
When the Nigerian government actively worked to build the capacity of local businesses, training them on how to meet standards, how to submit proper bids, and how to scale their operations to handle public contracts, it didn't just help those businesses.
It helped the government, too.
Yeah, it actually enhanced the transparency and accountability of the government's own service delivery.
And in South Africa, affirmative procurement is deeply institutionalized. The source material spends a lot of time unpacking South Africa's Preferential Procurement Policy Framework Act, the PPPFA.
And the broader policy of broad-based Black economic empowerment, or BBBE.
Right. And for you listening, it's crucial to look at how the academic texts parse these mechanisms. We're just reporting what the studies show here. The explicit legislated goal of policies like BBBE and the PPPFA is to use the leverage of state contracts for deep socioeconomic transformation.
That's the intent.
The aim is to structurally integrate historically disadvantaged individuals and Black-owned enterprises into the mainstream economy by giving them preferential scoring in the public tender process.
Right. The texts outline the intended goals of economic inclusion very clearly. However, the same academic papers also meticulously document the severe implementation challenges that arise in practice.
Right. There are definitely challenges.
The literature points out that while the policy aims for genuine empowerment, it frequently encounters systemic exploitation. Well, the sources highlight the phenomenon of fronting, where a shell company is set up with a disadvantaged individual as the nominal head just to win the contract, while the actual economic benefit flows elsewhere.
Ah, so it defeats the purpose.
Exactly. Furthermore, the texts note that these preference systems can sometimes lead to the state paying significant premium prices for standard goods, which loops back into the irregular expenditure warnings flagged by the Auditor General.
It creates a highly complex, often contradictory dual mandate for the state-owned enterprises and procurement officers.
Very much so.
Because by law, they're required to act with strict financial prudence and cost-effectiveness. But simultaneously, by law, they are mandated to drive socioeconomic development and transformation through their supply chains.
And when that delicate balance fails, or when the regulatory loopholes are exploited by what the literature terms tenderpreneurs.
Tenderpreneurs, right?
Yeah, you see a significant documented gap between the noble objective of the policy and the actual economic outcome on the ground.
It sounds like an incredibly difficult tightrope to walk. And as if balancing financial prudence with social inclusion wasn't complex enough, the texts introduce a third, increasingly prominent dimension to state buying.
Green public procurement, or GPP.
Yes. Governments are now trying to use their massive buying power to purchase goods and services that have a lower environmental impact. There is a comparative study in our stack looking at South Africa, Kenya, and Nigeria that is really revealing.
It provides a great snapshot of the varying levels of institutional maturity across the continent. South Africa leads the sample with a relatively mature, legally backed GPP system.
Okay.
Kenya is in a volatile transition phase. They've introduced legal mandates for green procurement, but the study notes they severely lack the institutional capacity and training to actually enforce those laws.
And Nigeria.
Nigeria is currently at the baseline, relying mostly on voluntary approaches and facing massive capacity gaps.
Okay, I have to ask a blunt question here on behalf of the listener.
Go ahead.
If you are a developing country struggling to provide basic, reliable electricity to your hospitals, or if your Auditor General is actively fighting a $400 billion corruption hemorrhage, isn't prioritizing green public procurement a massive distraction?
A lot of people ask that.
I mean, isn't buying green essentially a luxury for healthy nations?
That is the most common critique leveled against GPP in developing nations. But what's fascinating here is that the research shows green public procurement actually functions as a Trojan horse for vastly superior financial governance.
Okay, you have to explain that. How does buying recycled paper or solar panels improve financial governance?
It's not about the specific green product. It's about the mathematical methodology required to justify buying it. True green public procurement forces a government procurement officer to conduct what is called life cycle cost analysis.
Life cycle cost analysis, meaning they can't just look at the initial price tag.
Exactly. Imagine a municipality needs to buy backup power. A highly polluting, cheap diesel generator has a very low upfront cost. A cleaner, hybrid microgrid system has a much higher upfront cost. Under old basic procurement rules, the officer is forced to buy the diesel generator because it is the cheapest initial bid.
Because on paper, they save money today.
Right. But when you apply life cycle cost analysis, the officer must factor in the cost of diesel fuel for 10 years, the cost of frequent maintenance, and the long-term health impacts on the local community.
Oh, wow.
When you calculate the total cost of ownership over a decade, the cheap diesel generator is actually astronomically expensive.
Ah, I see. So GPP forces the bureaucracy to think in decades instead of budget cycles.
Exactly.
It forces them to mathematically evaluate the total economic reality of the purchase. And by institutionalizing that kind of rigorous long-term financial analysis, you inherently make it much harder for corrupt actors to push through short-term, wasteful, highly inflated contracts.
Right. You build a deeper institutional muscle.
It aligns environmental sustainability with long-term fiscal prudence. It proves that SCM reform is the linchpin for both fixing the budget and achieving broader policy goals.
Precisely.
That is a massive paradigm shift in how to view procurement. And this idea of using state purchasing power strategically transitions us perfectly to the broader macroeconomic vision detailed in these reports.
It does.
Because when a government uses its procurement budget to intentionally buy locally made goods, they aren't just trying to save money or be green, they are actively trying to incubate domestic industries.
Right. They want the things they consume to be manufactured at home.
And that links directly to this massive, ambitious concept of regional industrialization and what the reports call Factory Southern Africa.
This is where we need to zoom out and look at the global tectonic plates of manufacturing.
Okay, let's zoom out.
For the last 30 years, coastal China has been the undisputed factory of the world. But the global supply chain is shifting. Wages and production costs in China are rising rapidly.
And companies are looking elsewhere.
Right. The World Bank report notes a stunning demographic and economic projection. Over the next generation, an estimated 85 million manufacturing jobs are expected to migrate away from coastal China in search of lower-cost environments.
85 million jobs packing up and looking for a new home. That is a generational economic lottery ticket.
It is. And Sub-Saharan Africa, specifically the Southern African Customs Union region, is uniquely positioned to capture a massive share of that migration.
Because they have everything they need.
Exactly. The region has an abundance of natural capital, the raw minerals and agricultural land. They have a massive, young, surplus labor force, and relatively high-quality basic infrastructure compared to other developing regions.
This alignment of factors is the genesis of the Factory Southern Africa vision. The idea is that the region can transition from just exporting raw dirt and unrefined crops to becoming a globally integrated manufacturing hub.
But to actually pull that off, they can't operate as a collection of isolated, competing national economies. The reports heavily focus on the strategy of the Southern African Customs Union, or SACU. This includes South Africa, Botswana, Lesotho, Namibia, and Eswatini.
Right, those 5 nations.
SACU has explicitly pivoted their entire industrial strategy toward building regional value chains, or RVCs. The core philosophy is that they aren't trying to build everything everywhere all at once.
They are focusing their collective resources on 3 priority sectors where they believe they have a strong comparative advantage.
A very smart, targeted approach. Let's break down those 3 sectors.
First, agro-processing. This isn't just about growing food, it's about processing it. They want to develop integrated corridors across borders for meat, leather, and fruit.
Right.
Instead of Botswana exporting raw cattle hides to Europe, only to have consumers in South Africa buy back expensive Italian leather shoes, they want to capture that entire tanning and manufacturing process within the region.
Which keeps the value add locally.
Exactly. Second, pharmaceuticals and chemicals. The COVID-19 pandemic brutally exposed how dangerous it is for the continent to rely almost entirely on imports for essential medicines and vaccines.
Is a huge wake-up call.
So building regional vaccine manufacturing and chemical processing capacity is a major strategic priority. And third, textiles and clothing. This is about linking the specific countries that grow high-quality raw cotton to the high-volume established apparel manufacturing hubs elsewhere in the region.
Creating a seamless farm-to-fashion supply chain.
And the potential macroeconomic upside of executing these regional value chains is enormous. A study by the AFCFTA Secretariat, the body overseeing the African Continental Free Trade Area, stated that properly investing in and connecting these regional value chains could add $11 billion to Africa's GDP and create 750,000 direct jobs by 2035.
That is the prize at the end of the tunnel.
But capturing that prize requires navigating some very dangerous policy traps. And one of the biggest traps the sources warn against is the blunt, politically appealing instrument of local content laws. There is a fascinating, detailed case study in the texts about the Kenya petroleum sector that perfectly illustrates this danger.
It's a classic example.
So a few years ago, Kenya discovered roughly 560 million barrels of commercially viable, recoverable oil in the Turkana region.
Massive find.
Naturally, when a country strikes oil, the immediate reaction of the government and the local population is a demand to ensure that the wealth doesn't just flow out to multinational drilling companies.
Of course.
They want jobs, they want contracts, they want the wealth to stay in Kenya. So policymakers proposed a local content bill. The bill essentially aimed to legally force foreign oil companies to hire a strict percentage of local labor and source a strict percentage of their materials from Kenyan businesses.
Which, politically, is a completely understandable and highly popular reflex. Every sovereign nation wants to maximize the domestic developmental benefit of its finite natural resources.
Right. But the text details how this proposed bill sparked a massive, intense debate. There were immediate legal concerns that strict and flexible local content requirements would violate World Trade Organization or WTO rules on free trade.
Yes.
But more importantly, the economic realities on the ground clashed with the political desires.
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture of supply chain management, the Kenyan case study illustrates the fundamental mathematical danger of aggressive local content mandates.
Walk us through the math.
Let's say a government passes a law demanding that an international oil company source 50% of its highly specialized drilling pipes locally.
Okay.
But what if the local domestic market does not actually possess the heavy industrial capacity, the metallurgical skills, or the capital to produce those specific pipes at a globally competitive quality and price?
then the policy completely backfires. If the local factory can't make the pipe to the required safety standard, the oil company has two choices.
Right.
They either stop drilling, which means no oil revenue for anyone, or they are forced to buy substandard, massively overpriced pipes, which makes the entire oil extraction project economically unviable on the global market.
Exactly. When you force a mandate without the underlying industrial capacity, it leads to high-cost, inefficient local monopolies rather than globally competitive industries.
It's lose-lose.
Or even worse, it encourages that exact fronting behavior we discussed in the procurement section.
Wow, right.
Local shell companies simply import the high-quality pipes from Europe or China, slap a massive premium on the price, and pass them through to the oil company just to meet the legal local quota.
Without adding any actual value or creating any real manufacturing jobs.
Exactly. That is why SECU's strategy of regional value chains is conceptually superior to isolated national local content laws. It relies on what the literature calls a captive model of integration.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because the captive model requires acknowledging some uncomfortable truths about regional power dynamics. Explain how the captive model works because it highlights the massive economic imbalances within the SACU region.
The captive model is built on the undeniable economic hegemony of South Africa within the region. We noted earlier that South Africa's GDP sits around $349 billion.
Huge.
The next largest economy in the SACU group is a mere fraction of that size. In a regional value chain utilizing the captive model, South Africa acts as the anchor.
The anchor, okay.
It provides the primary consumer base, the massive retail networks, the deep financial capital, and the advanced ports that act as the gateway to global markets.
And the other countries.
The strategy dictates that the other smaller SACU nations like Lesotho or Eswatini should not try to build massive end-to-end industries that compete directly with South Africa. Instead, they should leverage their specific, localized comparative advantages. Perhaps they have lower labor costs, specific raw materials, or highly favorable tax regimes. They use those advantages to ramp up the production of specific components or intermediate goods that feed directly into the larger South African manufacturing hub.
Okay, I see the pure economic logic. It's a highly efficient division of labor. If Lesotho focuses entirely on making the zippers and buttons, and South Africa focuses on assembling the final jackets and shipping them globally, the whole region wins.
That's the theory, yes.
But politically, that seems like an almost impossible sell. How does the SACU leadership convince the politicians and citizens in smaller economies to just accept being component suppliers to South Africa rather than demanding their own end-to-end, fully independent industries? I mean, every local politician wants to cut the ribbon on the shiny final assembly plant in their own district, not just the factory that makes the screws.
You have zeroed in on the core political economy challenge of any regional integration effort. It requires an immense amount of trust, long-term vision, and a willingness for nations to surrender a degree of their absolute economic sovereignty.
That's a lot to ask.
It is. It requires political leaders to understand and communicate the concept of resource complementarity to their voters.
Resource complementarity.
Right. The cold mathematical reality is that the smaller economies simply do not have the internal market scale or the capital depth to compete globally on their own. If they let nationalism win and insist on strict, isolated national local content rules, they will build inefficient, uncompetitive industries.
Because they just don't have the scale.
Exactly. The opportunity costs of those inefficient, walled-off regulations will keep the entire SADC region locked out of global value chains. If a multinational company sees that regional supply lines are fractured by petty local content laws, they won't invest.
They'll just go somewhere else.
Those 85 million manufacturing jobs leaving China won't come to Southern Africa. They will go to Southeast Asia or Latin America instead. To win those jobs, the region has to present a unified, highly efficient, frictionless supply chain to the global market.
A frictionless supply chain. That phrase brings us to the final and arguably most tangible physical part of this entire deep dive.
The logistics.
Right. Because you can sit in a boardroom and draft the most brilliant economic policies. You can theoretically fix your SOEs. You can digitize your procurement to stop the $400 billion bleed. And you can map out brilliant regional value chains on a whiteboard.
Yep.
But if a physical truck carrying your locally manufactured goods takes 3 weeks to cross a border post, none of that theory matters. The global market will simply buy elsewhere. We have to talk about moving the goods, the
Yeah.
physical corridors, the logistics infrastructure, and the resilience of the actual supply chain.
This is the physical manifestation of economic governance. Logistics is where the macroeconomic theory literally meets the road.
And the data shows that the road is incredibly bumpy. The COVID-19 pandemic was a brutal global stress test for supply chains everywhere, but it completely exposed the highly brittle nature of the SADC region's supply chains.
Oh, absolutely.
When borders closed, when testing protocols were introduced, and when operational hours were reduced, the entire regional system choked. Trucks were backed up for dozens of kilometers at border posts, and trade basically just ground to a halt.
It was a nightmare scenario.
We can quantify this fragility using the World Bank's Logistics Performance Index, or the LPI. It scores logistics efficiency on a scale of 1 to 5. In the study provided, the global sample of countries scored an average of 2.85.
Okay.
The SADC region, however, scored 2.61. Now, a gap of 0.24 might not sound like a huge deal in a classroom, but in the razor-thin margins of global trade, it is a massive chasm.
The difference between profit and loss.
Exactly. And the biggest specific gap driving that low regional score was in the category of trade and transport infrastructure, where SADC scored a dismal 2.38 against the global sample's 2.71.
That infrastructure score is a direct reflection of severe compounding physical bottlenecks. And arguably the most critical bottleneck on the continent right now is this systemic underperformance of Transnet.
Which is the South African state-owned rail and port logistics monopoly.
Right. Because South Africa is the anchor economy we discussed in the captive model. When Transnet chokes, the entire region gasps for air.
It's a domino effect.
The reports detail how a combination of systemic governance failures, including severe chronic shortages of functioning locomotives and highly organized criminal syndicates stealing hundreds of kilometers of copper signaling cable, has essentially crippled the South African freight rail network.
And when the rail network is compromised, the economic reality is that the cargo doesn't just sit there and wait.
No, the economy has to keep moving.
The mining companies in the interior still have contracts. They still have to export their chrome, coal, and copper to the global market. So if they can't get a train, they put the bulk cargo on trucks.
Which is an absolute disaster for regional logistics efficiency and infrastructure maintenance.
Why is that?
Well, shifting heavy bulk commodities from rail to road exponentially increases the per ton logistics costs. But more devastatingly, it accelerates the physical wear and tear on the road network. These highways were not engineered to handle thousands of heavy coal trucks every single day.
Ah, I see.
The trucks degrade the asphalt faster than the national governments can physically or financially repair it.
So the roads just crumble.
Yes. Furthermore, it creates massive structural congestion at the border posts and the port terminals. The source texts note a horrifying statistic. Disruptions and inefficiencies at South African ports alone cost the broader economy an estimated 100 million rand every single day.
Every single day. That's insane.
This systemic logistical inefficiency threatens the very profit margins that make the entire vision of Factory Southern Africa viable. If it costs too much money and takes too much time to get the finished product from the factory floor in Lesotho to the port in Durban, the factory will inevitably close, and those jobs will go to Vietnam.
The stakes are incredibly high. But as I read further into the physical logistics reports, I realized we aren't just looking at a landscape of unsolvable problems.
Definitely not.
The sources also highlight massive tangible solutions that are actively working to bypass these bottlenecks right now. There are major physical infrastructure projects fundamentally reshaping the map of regional trade. For instance, the reports highlight the Kazungula Bridge.
The Kazungula Bridge is a phenomenal piece of strategic infrastructure. It is a massive bridge spanning the Zambezi River, directly connecting Botswana and Zambia.
Right.
Historically, a massive volume of regional freight had to rely on highly unreliable, slow-moving ferries at that river crossing, or trucks had to take a massive time-consuming detour through the old north-south corridor in Zimbabwe, which was plagued by border delays and poor road conditions.
Because there's just a massive choke point.
Exactly. The new bridge allows regional freight to completely bypass those old bottlenecks, creating a highly efficient direct link from the massive port of Durban straight up into the landlocked markets of Central Africa.
The reports also highlight the recent modernization of the Beitbridge border post between South Africa and Zimbabwe, which was executed through a public-private partnership, or PPP.
Yes.
They are utilizing private capital and expertise to drastically compress the dwell times for trucks at the border. And across the region, there is a massive push for the implementation of one-stop border posts, or OSBPs.
Which are game changers.
Yeah, if you are listening and wondering what an OSBP is, imagine driving a truck across a border. Historically, you have to stop on the exporting country's side, wait in line, clear customs, then drive across the physical border, stop on the importing country's side, wait in a completely different line, and clear customs again with a different set of officials.
Just massive duplication of effort.
Exactly. An OSBP consolidates that. Customs officials from both countries sit in the exact same building, sharing systems, so a truck only has to be processed and inspected once instead of twice. It literally cuts the border delay in half.
It's such a simple, elegant solution.
There's also a really fascinating, detailed case study on Malawi in the texts that proves how vital this physical plumbing is. Malawi is completely landlocked, so their entire national economy, their ability to survive, relies on accessing the sea through the Nacala and Beira corridors, which run entirely through the neighboring country of Mozambique.
Right.
To move their primary agricultural exports, tobacco, tea, and sugar to global markets, Malawi relies heavily on the Sea Railway concession.
Right, the CE work.
And this project involved massive private sector participation, specifically a staggering $5 billion investment by the Brazilian multinational mining company Vale. Vale needed a way to export coal from Mozambique, so they heavily financed the rehabilitation of the rail lines and the deepwater port facilities, which Malawi now utilizes for its agriculture.
It's a win-win.
It is a perfect example of how private capital, when aligned with a stable governance framework, can unlock regional infrastructure that sovereign governments simply cannot afford to build on their own.
It is a brilliant example of aligned incentives. But we have to recognize a fundamental truth about modern supply chain management.
Which is?
Pouring concrete for new bridges and laying steel for new railways is only half the battle. If you only focus on the physical infrastructure, you will still fail. The non-physical infrastructure is just as critical.
Non-physical infrastructure, what do you mean by that? Are we talking about the internet?
I mean, the rules, the data, the regulations in the software that govern exactly how the physical infrastructure is allowed to be used. I'm talking about regulatory interoperability.
Interoperability, okay.
Think about the driver of that truck moving goods from South Africa to Zambia. Does that driver need a completely different translated commercial license for every single sovereign country they cross?
That would be a nightmare.
It has been. SADC has been working for years on standardizing commercial driver's licenses and vehicle regulations. Furthermore, are the customs classifications harmonized across the region? If a country builds a beautiful, freshly paved, multi-lane highway leading to the border, but the customs paperwork takes 4 days to process because the computer systems don't talk to each other, the supply chain is still broken. The physical road is clear, but the regulatory road is blocked.
This is where the concept of tracking and tracing capabilities becomes absolutely vital. The LPI data shows that the SADC region trails significantly behind the global average in this specific area.
Yes, they do.
In a modern, highly integrated global supply chain, especially with the explosion of e-commerce demanding predictive, next-day cross-border delivery logistics providers have to know exactly where a shipment is at all times. They need visibility.
And to address this critical gap, the source texts heavily advocate for the widespread implementation of an electronic cargo tracking system, or ECTS.
How does an ECTS actually work in practice?
Well, it utilizes GPS tracking technology combined with electronic, tamper-proof seals placed directly on the cargo containers at the port of entry. It allows regional customs authorities to monitor the movement and the integrity of the freight in real time as it moves across the continent. If a truck deviates from its approved transit route, or if someone tries to break the electronic seal to tamper with the cargo, the system immediately flags the anomaly.
That's brilliant.
It drastically reduces illicit trade, smuggling, and the dumping of transit goods into local markets. And because customs officials can inherently trust the digital data trail of an ECTS sealed container, they can confidently clear the cargo much faster at the border without requiring a manual physical inspection of every single box.
But again, I have to play the skeptic here.
Sure.
Is tech really the silver bullet for this region? Can fancy e-logistics platforms, GPS seals, and maybe even future drone deliveries really leapfrog the physical reality that a massive portion of the secondary road network is still unpaved? Or leapfrog the reality that a truck driver can still be held up for 3 days by a corrupt border official demanding a cash bribe?
If we connect this to the bigger picture of economic governance, the answer is no. Technology is not a replacement for asphalt. You cannot digitize a pothole.
Right.
If the physical bridge collapses, the GPS tracker just tells you exactly where the truck fell in the river.
Fair point.
But technology is an incredibly powerful enabler of compliance and efficiency. Systems like ECTS and automated digital AFC-FTA certificates of origin trim the administrative burden and the compliance costs dramatically.
Which saves money.
And that reduction in bureaucratic cost and delay is the absolute oxygen that small and medium-sized regional carriers need to survive. It allows smaller logistics firms to participate in regional trade without being completely crushed by overhead costs.
It levels the playing field.
Yes. Furthermore, it brings intense digital visibility to the supply chain. Just as we discussed with e-procurement earlier, a digital audit trail is the absolute best disinfectant against corruption. A border official is much less likely to demand a bribe to release a truck if they know the truck's exact location and dwell time are being tracked live on a dashboard in the capital city.
So it all comes back to economic governance. Whether it is buying a water pump or tracking a truck across a bridge, the digital audit trail enforces the rules and protects the sovereign wealth.
It's all connected.
We have covered an immense amount of ground today. If you have been tracking with us on this journey, we have seen that fixing Sub-Saharan Africa's macroeconomic growth trajectory, moving it off that stalling speed of 1.4%, isn't about discovering some magic hidden pot of international development money.
No, it's not.
It is fundamentally about optimizing the deep plumbing of the economy. It requires breaking down those massive, inefficient, deeply indebted state-owned enterprises and forcefully commercializing them through independent holding companies.
Right.
It requires cleaning up a $400 billion public procurement system and using that immense purchasing power to strategically build domestic industries while relying on life cycle cost analysis to avoid the traps of short-term corruption. Yeah. It means realizing the ambitious vision of Factory Southern Africa by intelligently localizing industrial value chains within SACU, acknowledging the captive model and the necessity of regional trust over isolated nationalism.
It's a huge shift in mindset.
And ultimately, it requires lubricating the physical borders, both with concrete infrastructure like the Kazungula Bridge and with digital tracking systems like ECTS to let trade flow efficiently.
It is a monumental generational task.
Yeah.
But the blueprint is clearly laid out in the research. And as we conclude, there is one final overarching concept drawn from the deep themes of these reports that I want to leave you to mull over.
Oh, I like a good final thought.
We have talked extensively today about the imperative of unleashing the private sector and getting the heavy hand of the state out of the way of business. But there is a massive, fascinating paradox at the very heart of this entire transition.
A paradox.
Yes. The IMF frequently references a political economy concept called the narrow corridor. It is the idea that to truly unlock vibrant private sector-led growth, the state must simultaneously do two highly contradictory things.
Okay, what are they?
On one hand, it must aggressively shrink its footprint in doing business. It must stop trying to run the railways. It must stop trying to generate all the electricity. And it must stop monopolizing critical industries.
Right, stepping back.
But at the exact same time, the state must drastically expand its capacity and its power to govern and regulate that business.
Wow, okay.
As it steps back from being a player, it has to become exponentially stronger in enforcing legal contracts, maintaining anti-monopoly competition policies, regulating environmental standards, and running hyper-efficient, corruption-free customs agencies. Finding and managing to stay in that narrow corridor where the state is strong enough to effectively govern but restrained enough not to stifle innovation is the ultimate defining test of Africa's economic future.
The narrow corridor. Shrinking the state as a player, but massively strengthening the state as a referee. That is a brilliant, clarifying framework to view all of this complex machinery through.
It really is.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We hope that the next time you pick up a product, whether it is a piece of clothing or a piece of machinery, and you see a simple made in SADC or made in South Africa label, you will think differently about what it took to get it into your hands.
Absolutely.
You will know that behind that small label is a vast, complex, and rapidly evolving machinery of logistics corridors, regional value chains, and economic governance fighting to move an entire continent forward. And hopefully that murky diagnostic X-ray of the global economy just got a little bit clearer for you. Until next time.